In 1587, an entire English colony of 115 men, women, and children vanished without a trace from Roanoke Island. When supply ships returned 3 years later, they found only empty houses and the mysterious word Croatoan carved into a post. But Roanoke wasn't alone in its tragic fate. Across the globe, dozens of colonial ventures met equally dramatic ends, their stories buried beneath the triumphant narratives of successful settlements. These forgotten failures reveal the brutal reality of early colonization, a tale of ambition crushed by disease, starvation, indigenous resistance, and sheer human folly. While we celebrate Plymouth Rock and Jamestown, history has conveniently forgotten the catastrophic attempts that preceded and paralleled these eventual successes. These lost colonies represent more than mere footnotes. They embody the dreams and nightmares of an age when Europeans believed they could plant their flags anywhere in the world and call it home. Their failures illuminate the razor-thin margins between colonial triumph and disaster, reminding us that for every successful settlement, countless others crumbled into dust. Let's dive into the top 10 failed colonies that history forgot, and number 8 will shock you. Number 1. Roanoke Colony 1587-1590. The Vanishing Act. The most famous failed colony in American history began with grand ambitions and ended with one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Sir Walter Raleigh's third attempt to establish an English foothold in the New World seemed promising when 115 colonists, including women and children, landed on Roanoke Island off the coast of present-day North Carolina. Led by John White, the colony faced immediate challenges. Supply shortages forced White to return to England for provisions, but the Anglo-Spanish War delayed his return for 3 years. When he finally arrived in August 1590, he found the settlement completely abandoned. Houses had been carefully dismantled, suggesting an organized departure rather than a panicked flight. The only clue was Croatoan, carved into a wooden post, possibly referring to nearby Croatoan Island, now Hatteras Island. Theories about the colonists' fate range from integration with local Native American tribes to migration to other locations, starvation, or massacre. Despite centuries of investigation, including modern archaeological efforts, the Roanoke colonists remain missing. Their disappearance marked the end of Raleigh's colonial ambitions and served as a stark warning about the perils of inadequate support for distant settlements. Number 2. Sagadahoc Colony 1607-1608, Maine's frozen dream, while Jamestown struggled to survive in Virginia. Another English colony attempted to take root for 150 miles north along the coast of Maine. The Plymouth Company established Sagadahoc Colony at the mouth of the Kennebec River in August 1607, just 3 months after Jamestown's founding. Led by George Popham and Raleigh Gilbert, approximately 100 colonists built Fort St. George and prepared for permanent settlement. Unlike their southern counterparts, the Sagadahoc colonists faced the full brunt of a Maine winter, something their English experience hadn't prepared them for. Temperatures plummeted far below anything they had endured, and their inadequate shelters provided little protection against the bitter cold. The colony's death knell came with tragic timing. George Popham died during the harsh winter, and news arrived that Raleigh Gilbert had inherited property in England, requiring his return. Facing another brutal winter without experienced leadership, the surviving colonists abandoned Sagadahoc in September 1608. They dismantled their fort and sailed back to England, leaving behind only archaeological traces of their brief, frozen existence. The failure of Sagadahoc demonstrated that successful colonization required not just courage and supplies, but careful consideration of climate and seasonal challenges. It would be another 12 years before the Pilgrims successfully established themselves at Plymouth, having learned from Sagadahoc's mistakes. Number 3. Darien Scheme 1695-1700, Scotland's colonial catastrophe. Scotland's attempt to establish a colonial empire nearly bankrupted the entire nation and ultimately contributed to the Act of Union with England in 1707. The Darien Scheme, also known as the Darien Disaster, represented one of history's most spectacular colonial failures. The Company of Scotland, inspired by dreams of controlling trade between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, chose the Darien Peninsula in present-day Panama as the site for New Caledonia. The location seemed strategically perfect, a narrow strip of land where goods could be transported overland between the two great oceans, avoiding the dangerous journey around Cape Horn. Between 1695 and 1700, Scotland invested an estimated £400,000 in the venture, roughly equivalent to half the nation's available capital. 5 expeditions carried approximately 2,500 Scottish colonists to Darien. The results were catastrophic. The colonists arrived to find a disease-infested swampland rather than the paradise described by promoters. Yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery decimated the settlers. Spanish forces, claiming the territory as their own, attacked the weakened colonies. Food supplies rotted in the tropical heat, and the promised trade routes proved non-existent. Of the 2,500 colonists who sailed for Darien, fewer than 100 returned to Scotland alive. The financial disaster ruined thousands of Scottish investors and left the nation so economically weakened that it had little choice but to accept political union with England in 1707. Number 4. Ajacan Mission, 1570 to 1571. Spanish dreams dashed in Virginia. Decades before Jamestown, Spanish Jesuits attempted to establish a mission in the Chesapeake Bay region they called Ajacan. This forgotten colony represents one of the earliest European attempts to permanently settle in what would become Virginia, and its tragic end foreshadowed the difficulties future colonists would face. In September 1570, 8 Jesuit missionaries and a young boy arrived at Ajacan, guided by a Native American they called Don Luis. This indigenous man had been kidnapped by Spanish explorers years earlier, taken to Spain, converted to Christianity, and educated in Spanish ways. The Jesuits believed Don Luis would serve as their interpreter and cultural bridge to local tribes. The mission began hopefully. The Jesuits established their settlement near present-day Williamsburg and began their work of conversion. However, Don Luis soon abandoned the mission and returned to his people. Whether motivated by homesickness, deception, or genuine religious conviction, he helped orchestrate an attack on the mission in February 1571. Native warriors killed all but one of the Jesuits, a young boy named Alonso, who was spared, possibly due to his age. When a Spanish relief expedition arrived in 1572, they found only Alonso, who told them of the massacre. The Spanish never again attempted to establish a permanent settlement in the Chesapeake region, leaving the area open for future English colonization. Number 5. Port Carolina 156 for 1565. France's Florida fiasco. France's attempt to establish a foothold in Spanish-claimed Florida ended in massacre and demonstrated the deadly seriousness with which European powers guarded their colonial claims. Port Carolina, established by René Guélain de Laudonnière in 1564, was intended to serve as a base for French privateers attacking Spanish treasure ships and as a refuge for French Huguenots fleeing religious persecution. Number 6. Charlesfort 156 to 1563. South Carolina's short-lived start to years before Port Carolina, France made its first attempt at North American colonization with Charlesfort, established on what is now Parris Island, South Carolina. Captain Jean Ribaut founded the colony in 1562 with 30 volunteers, intending to create a permanent French presence in Spanish-claimed territory. The colony's location on Port Royal Sound seemed promising, offering access to both ocean and inland waterways. The French built a small fort and established friendly relations with local Native American tribes. However, Charlesfort suffered from fundamental flaws in planning and leadership. When Ribaut returned to France for supplies, he became caught up in the French wars of religion and couldn't return as planned. The colonists, left without reinforcement or relief, faced mounting hardships. Food supplies dwindled, and the promised riches failed to materialize. Discipline broke down under the strain of isolation and uncertainty. Number 7. Popham Colony 1607-1608, Virginia's northern twin. While most Americans know about Jamestown's struggles, few remember that England simultaneously attempted to establish a second colony 450 miles to the north. The Virginia Company's northern branch, known as the Plymouth Company, established Popham Colony at the mouth of Maine's Kennebec River in August 1607. Led by George Popham and Raleigh Gilbert, the colony initially appeared more promising than Jamestown. The 100 colonists built Fort St. George, constructed several buildings, and even built a small ship called the Virginia, one of the first vessels constructed by Europeans in North America. Unlike Jamestown, Popham Colony maintained better relations with local Abenaki peoples and avoided the devastating mortality rates that plagued their southern counterpart. Number 8. Sable Island Colony 1598-1603. Graveyard of the Atlantic. One of history's most bizarre colonial experiments took place on Sable Island, a crescent-shaped sandbar 175 miles southeast of Nova Scotia. Known today as the Graveyard of the Atlantic for the hundreds of shipwrecks scattered around its shores, Sable Island seemed an unlikely place for colonial settlement. The Marquis de la Roche received a charter from King Henry IV of France to establish a colony in North America. Needing colonists, he recruited from French prisons, offering convicts freedom in exchange for colonial service. In 1598, he deposited 40 prisoners on Sable Island, intending it as a temporary base while he explored the mainland for a more suitable location. La Roche sailed away, promising to return within a year with supplies and to relocate the colonists. However, political troubles in France prevented his return. The abandoned prisoners faced one of the most hostile environments imaginable. Sable Island offered no trees for shelter or fuel, no fresh water except rainwater, and no protection from brutal Atlantic storms. Number 9. Martin's 100-1619-16-2. Virginia's Forgotten Massacre. While most colonial disasters occurred during initial settlement phases, Martin's 100 demonstrates that even established colonies remained vulnerable to catastrophic failure. This Virginia plantation, located across the James River from Jamestown, was one of the most ambitious and well-funded colonial enterprises of its time. Established in 1619 by the Society of Martin's 100, the settlement represented a new model of colonial development. Rather than relying on individual settlers or small groups, the society recruited entire families and skilled craftsmen, providing them with tools, supplies, and livestock. By 1622, Martin's 100 had grown to include over 200 residents living in more than 20 buildings. The plantation appeared to be thriving when disaster struck on March 22, 1622. As part of a coordinated uprising led by Ajacan Powhatan warriors attacked settlements throughout the Virginia colony. Martin's 100, despite its apparent security, suffered devastating losses. Archaeological evidence suggests the attack was swift and brutal, catching residents completely by surprise. Number 10. Raleigh's Lost Colony of 1585. Roanoke's forgotten predecessor. Most people know about the famous Lost Colony of 1587. But few remember that Sir Walter Raleigh's first attempt at Roanoke colonization occurred 2 years earlier and ended in equally dramatic failure. The 1585 colony, led by Ralph Lane, provides crucial context for understanding why the later settlement also failed. Lane arrived at Roanoke Island with 107 colonists in July 1585, establishing the first English settlement in North America. Unlike the later colony that included families, Lane's settlement consisted entirely of men soldiers, craftsmen, and gentlemen seeking fortune. The military nature of the colony created immediate problems with local Native American tribes. Initially, the English maintained friendly relations with the Roanoke and Croatan peoples, but cultural misunderstandings and English demands for food tribute quickly soured relationships. Lane's aggressive tactics, including taking hostages and burning villages, transformed potential allies into enemies. The colony's survival increasingly depended on dwindling supplies from England. These 10 failed colonies represent more than historical curiosities. They illuminate the extraordinary challenges faced by early European colonists and the razor-thin margins between success and catastrophe. Each failure taught valuable lessons that informed later, more successful colonial ventures. The patterns that emerge from these failures are striking. Poor leadership, inadequate supplies, disease, harsh climates, and conflicts with indigenous peoples repeatedly doomed colonial ventures. Those colonies that survived and thrived did so not through superior courage or determination, but through learning from these earlier mistakes, securing more reliable supply lines, and developing more sustainable relationships with Native American peoples. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more videos.